symbol. There is a rare kind of wisdom that only comes to a man who has lived his life in the skin of others. Sir Ian McKellen is a titan of the classical stage in the face of modern mythology, a man who rose from the local theaters of northern England to become a global symbol of wisdom and power. At 85 years old, he has spent over 6 decades observing the human condition from the most intimate vantage point possible, the shared silence of the theater wings and the high-pressure environment of the film set. He has worked with the old gods of the stage and the rebels of New Hollywood, and in that time he has seen that the most talented souls are often the most haunted, and sometimes the most cruel.
McKellen wasn't just a performer, he was a silent witness. He saw the way ego could turn a legend into a tyrant, and the masks of kindness slip when the audience wasn't looking. Today, the legendary curtain is finally raised on the secrets he has.
We explore the 25 actors Ian McKellen faced who proved that, beneath the shimmering spotlight, lay hearts of chilling ruthlessness and profound darkness. Here is a rare kind of wisdom that only comes to a man who has lived his life in the skin of others. Sir Ian McKellen, Celebrity Count 1. Is a titan of the classical stage and the face of modern mythology, a man who rose from the local theaters of northern England to become a global icon of wisdom and power. At 85 years old, he has spent over 6 decades observing the human condition from the most intimate vantage point possible, the shared space of the stage and the high-pressure environment of the film set. He has worked with the old gods of the theater and the rebels of the New Hollywood, and in that time, he has seen that the most talented souls are often the most haunted, and sometimes the most cruel. Ian McKellen wasn't just a performer, he was a silent witness. He saw the way ego could turn a legend into a tyrant, and how the pursuit of a performance could justify the destruction of those around them. He saw the masks of kindness slip in the wings of the theater, and the cold calculation that lurked behind a cinematic smile. Today, the legendary curtain is raised on the secrets he has kept. We explore the 25 actors Ian McKellen faced who proved that beneath the shimmering light of the spotlight lay hearts of chilling ruthlessness and profound darkness. We begin with the man who sat upon the throne of British acting when Ian was just beginning his ascent. Laurence Olivier, Celebrity Count 2. To the world, he was Lord Olivier, the pinnacle of artistic achievement. But to those who shared a dressing room with him, Olivier was a man of chilling professional ruthlessness. McKellen saw how Olivier treated the theater not as a collaborative space, but as a battlefield where he was the only victor allowed. Olivier was known for a professional jealousy that bordered on the sadistic, particularly toward younger actors who displayed a more natural, modern brilliance. He would use his immense power to systematically undermine rivals, ensuring they were given the worst direction or the most difficult lighting to make himself shine brighter. He viewed acting as a weapon of dominance, and his coldness toward his colleagues was legendary. He was a man who had mastered the mechanics of the stage but had, in the process, seemingly discarded the basic empathy of the human heart, proving that the most respected names in history could also be the coldest architects of professional isolation. If Olivier was the cold king, Vivien Leigh, Celebrity Count 3, represented a different, more tragic kind of darkness. While the world worshipped her as the ultimate romantic lead, Ian McKellen saw the reality of her profound instability and the way it was weaponized against those around her. Vivien was a woman struggling with immense internal pain, but she often used that pain as a tool for manipulation. She was known for emotional terrorism on set, creating atmospheres of intense, unbearable tension to force her co-stars into a state of submission. She would oscillate between manic affection and chilling, biting cruelty, leaving those who worked with her in a state of permanent exhaustion. Behind the beautiful face of Scarlett O'Hara was a soul that was often lost in a darkness so deep that she sought to pull everyone else into it, a reminder that the most fragile among us can sometimes be the most destructive to the people who try to help them. John Gielgud, Celebrity Count 4, was the third of the great theatrical trinity, but beneath his elegant, musical voice was a personality that could be bitingly, cruelly dismissive. While McKellen maintained a respectful relationship with him, he saw how Gielgud used his status as a living legend to belittle the efforts of the younger generation. Gielgud possessed a specific kind of intellectual arrogance, a way of delivering a critique that was so refined it felt like a surgical strike to a fellow actor's confidence. He had no patience for those who didn't meet his rigid standards of proper acting, and he was known to maintain a distance that wasn't just professional, it was exclusionary. He was a man who lived in a world of his own making, and he treated the people who inhabited the real world with a polite but unmistakable contempt that left a trail of hollowed-out spirits in his wake. Marlon Brando, Celebrity Count 5, is often cited as the man who changed everything. But McKellen remembers a man whose genius had become a tool for psychological siege. By the 1970s, Brando had become a figure of backstage dread, a man who seemed to despise the very industry that gave him a platform. He didn't just sabotage productions, he systematically tortured his directors and co-stars. He would refuse to learn his lines, force hours of nonsensical changes to scenes, and maintain an atmosphere of low-level, aggressive hostility that made collaboration impossible. Brando possessed a terrifying capacity for casual cruelty, treating his fellow performers like insects to be observed and discarded, rather than colleagues to be respected. He was a man who had found the highest peak of fame and decided to spend his time there making everyone else's life a living nightmare, leaving a legacy of brilliant film and shattered morale. Faye Dunaway, Celebrity Count 6, represents the Ice Queen of the cinematic era, a woman whose extraordinary beauty was often used as a shield for a chillingly calculated malice. Ian McKellen, moving through the world of prestige cinema, saw how Dunaway used her talent as a psychological weapon. She was a woman who seemed to find her only peace in conflict, often targeting the most vulnerable members of a film crew to exert her total dominance. She would halt productions worth millions over the smallest perceived slights, taking a visible pleasure in the anxiety and fear she generated in others. A state of permanent, aggressive paranoia, viewing the entire industry as a zero-sum game where she only won if someone else was suffering. Behind the sophisticated exterior was a mind that viewed human connection as a technical flaw to be exploited, proving that some stars don't just shine, they seek to blind everyone in their orbit. Klaus Kinski, Celebrity Count 7, was a name that carried a physical weight of terror, even in the refined circles of the classical stage. While McKellen always maintained his poise, the stories of Kinski's genuine, unhinged madness were a constant shadow in the industry. Kinski wasn't just difficult, he was a predator on every set he ever occupied. He was known for physical violence, psychological terrorism, and an ego so vast it threatened to consume everything it touched. He possessed an absolute lack of human empathy, believing that his status as an artist gave him a license to abuse everyone from directors to the lowest-paid crew members. He didn't just play villains, he brought a very real, very present darkness into the lives of those forced to work with him, leaving a trail of genuine trauma that lasted long after the production had finished. Peter O'Toole, Celebrity Count 8, was a man of immense charm, but Ian McKellen saw the darkness that lurked behind the blue eyes and the witty anecdotes. O'Toole possessed a charming malice, a way of being brilliantly entertaining while simultaneously cutting someone to the bone. He was a man of extreme highs and lows, and when the lows hit, he became a figure of chilling professional instability. He would use his immense intellect to find the specific insecurities of his co-stars and pick at them under the guise of artistic exploration. He was a man who felt the world was a stage that was beneath his talent, and he often treated the people on it with a dismissive coldness that left them feeling hollow and discarded, proving that a sharp wit is often the most effective tool for a cruel heart. Richard Burton, Celebrity Count 9, was a man who possessed the voice of a god, but his spirit was frequently described as a study in checked, scholarly malice. McKellen, who was a contemporary of the great Welshman, saw how Burton used his talent as a weapon of self-destruction that frequently collateralized everyone around him. Burton was a man who hated the medium of film, and he took that resentment out on the people who worked beside him. He would arrive on set and systematically humiliate directors and CO stars with a biting, scholarly arrogance, making everyone feel uneducated and small in his presence. He was a man hollowed out by his own fame and his addiction to vodka, leaving nothing behind but a collection of brilliant characters and a legacy of personal and professional pain that he inflicted with a clinical, terrifying precision. Frank Sinatra, Celebrity Count 10, was the chairman of the board, and while Ian McKellen's world was primarily the stage, he moved through the high-stakes circles where Sinatra's name was spoken with a mixture of awe and genuine fear. Sinatra used his power like a mob boss, using intimidation as his primary currency. If he felt slighted, even by an imagined gesture, he didn't just argue. He sought to professionally erase the offender. He was known to use his deep connections to blacklist performers and intimidate anyone who stood in his path. He possessed a dark, brooding intensity that could flip from charm to chilling menace in an instant. Behind the velvet voice was a man who possessed a capacity for cold, calculated malice that turned his entire world into a minefield of anxiety and broken loyalties. The shadows of the stage are long, but they are nothing compared to the cold, calculated manipulation that Bette Davis, Celebrity Count 11, brought into the industry. While she is celebrated as a pioneer for women in film, Sir Ian McKellen saw the reports of a woman who used her talent as a blunt instrument. Her rivalries were not merely for the headlines. They were systematic campaigns of professional sabotage. She was known to use her legendary wit to cut CO stars down to the bone, often waiting until the very moment before the cameras rolled to deliver a stinging personal insult intended to shatter a fellow actor's confidence. She possessed a warrior spirit that had curdled into a bitter, unforgiving intolerance for anything less than total deference. Behind those famous eyes was a mind that viewed the industry as a zero-sum game, leaving a legacy of scorched earth and broken professional relationships in every studio she ever occupied. She was a star who shone brightly, but she was a star that burned anything that came too close to her orbit. One of the most painful secrets Ian McKellen understands involves a man the world remembers as a joyful, athletic icon, Gene Kelly, Celebrity Count. To watch Gene Kelly was to watch the definition of grace, but the reality of his rehearsals was a nightmare of psychological and physical endurance. Kelly was a relentless, often cruel perfectionist who viewed his partners not as people, but as tools to be used until they broke. He was known to scream vile insults at his dancers until they were reduced to tears, only to demand they keep dancing on bloody feet for the sake of a flawless frame. McKellen recalls the stories of Kelly's cold, detached anger, a man who would not tolerate the slightest human error and who used physical and vocal intimidation as a primary means of direction. The joy we see in his films was a beautiful lie, manufactured out of an atmosphere of genuine misery and physical exhaustion. The list of those who mistook their fame for a throne continues with Yul Brynner, Celebrity Count 13. To the public, he was the exotic, commanding king. But Ian McKellen and those who shared the industry floor with him saw an autocratic ruler who never allowed the curtain to. Brynner didn't just play royalty, he demanded it from every person on set. He was known for a cold, impenetrable wall of silence that he would use to unsettle his co-stars, speaking only to issue commands or sharp critiques. He had a way of looking through people as if they were insignificant parts of the scenery, a psychological dismissal that could crush a young actor's confidence in seconds. McKellen remembers the stories of how Yul would demand absolute stillness and silence from the entire crew, creating an atmosphere of stifling fear that made filmmaking feel like an exercise in survival rather than art. Ilton Burl, Celebrity Count 14, known as Uncle Milty, was the first true superstar of the television age, but backstage, he was a man whose ego was a destructive force. McKellen, observing the industry transition as the old variety stars faded, saw a man who felt he owned the medium. Burleigh was notorious for professional bullying, often stealing material from younger comics and using his massive influence to bury anyone who didn't show him the deference he felt he deserved. He would humiliate writers in front of the entire staff and sabotage his guest segments to ensure he remained the absolute center of gravity. He was a man who craved the love of the public, but held nothing but contempt for the individuals who worked to make him look good. His uncle persona was a thin veil for a deeply insecure and frequently malicious showman who treated people like expendable stepping stones. Mickey Rooney, Celebrity Count 15, was the ultimate child star who never truly learned how to exist in a world that stopped treating him like a prince. Ian McKellen watched as Rooney navigated his later career with a chip on his shoulder the size of a mountain. He was notoriously abrasive, often shouting down directors and treating his fellow actors with a biting sarcasm that made any kind of creative collaboration impossible. He carried a deep, simmering resentment for the way the industry had changed, and he took that bitterness out on everyone he encountered. He was a man who had been told he was a legend since he was a child, and he used that status as a weapon to make everyone else feel inferior. He spent his final decades in a cycle of professional conflict and personal turmoil. A man who ended up with a reputation for being one of the most difficult and vindictively cruel people in Hollywood. Even the voices that brought the most comfort to the world had their hidden discords. Bing Crosby, celebrity count 16, was the father figure of America, a man whose smooth baritone seemed to calm the entire world. But McKellen, and later Crosby's own children, revealed a man who was cold, clinical, and often cruelly disciplinarian behind the scenes. Backstage, the mellow Bing was a man of ironclad, often terrifying control. He was known to be distant and demanding, showing little of the warmth he projected to his millions of fans. He treated his family with a business-like detachment, and his colleagues with a chilling lack of empathy that felt like a betrayal to those who grew up on his wholesome image. He was a man who had mastered the art of the facade, proving that the most comforting voices in history could sometimes belong to the coldest and most manipulative hearts. William Shatner, celebrity count 17, represents a different kind of darkness, one of absolute, all-consuming ego. While McKellen moved through the industry with a quiet, observant confidence, he watched as the cast of Shatner's contemporaries struggled under the weight of his need for total dominance. Shatner was notorious for stealing lines, demanding that the cameras always be focused on him, and treating his fellow actors as if they were invisible props. This wasn't just professional ambition, it was a systematic erasure of the people around him. He created an atmosphere of deep resentment and isolation on set, choosing to be the center of a lonely universe rather than part of it. He remains a symbol of how the desperate need for validation can turn a person into a black hole of narcissism that sucks the joy and the creativity out of everyone else's life. Alain Delon, celebrity count 18, represents a specific kind of European darkness, a man of such startling physical perfection that the world was willing to overlook a personality described as chillingly sociopathic. Ian McKellen, having navigated the global cinematic landscape, heard the stories of Delon's detached and often calculated cruelty. Delon wasn't just arrogant, he was cold, a star who seemed to lack the basic heat of human empathy. He was known for his involvement in dark underworld scandals and a total lack of remorse for the way he discarded both professional rivals and romantic partners. He walked through the industry as a predator who viewed kindness as a technique. McKellen remembers the reports of Delon's icy demeanor, a man who used his beauty to lure people in, only to freeze them out with a clinical, terrifying indifference. Rex Harrison, celebrity count 19, is a name that still carries a chill in certain theatrical circles. Known as the quintessential English gentleman, Harrison was a man of staggering arrogance and calculated coldness. McKellen recalls the stories of Harrison's treatment of those he considered beneath him, which, in his mind, was almost everyone. He would often refuse to speak to crew members or younger actors, using his sharp tongue to humiliate performers during rehearsals if they failed to meet his impossible standards. He was notoriously indifferent to the suffering of others, even in the face of personal tragedy among his colleagues. His reaction was often one of detached concern for his own schedule. He had become so convinced of his own brilliance that he viewed the rest of humanity as mere set dressing in the grand production of his own. Jerry Lewis, celebrity count 20, is a name that McKellen associates with a specific kind of tragic and erratic brilliance. Lewis was a pioneer of comedy, but he possessed a dark, volatile streak that made him one of the most difficult men in the history of the industry. He was known for sudden, inexplicable shifts from manic affection to cold, biting cruelty. He treated his assistants and CO stars with a level of dismissiveness that bordered on the sadistic, often making them wait for hours just to satisfy a sudden whim. He used his fame as a license to be unmanageable, disrupting sets and alienating the very people who were trying to help him look his best. Behind the goofy kid act was a man who felt the world owed him everything and who was willing to humiliate anyone to get his way. Alula Bankhead, celebrity count 21, was a force of nature, but that nature was often destructive. A legend of the stage and screen, She was a woman whose wit was a lethal weapon. Ian McKellen remembers her as a person who possessed a frightening lack of boundaries. She would use her fame to shock, offend, and manipulate everyone in her orbit. Her eccentricity was often a cover for a genuinely mean-spirited streak, where she would publicly mock the insecurities of those around her just to see them flinch. She was a woman who craved chaos and would often manufacture it at the expense of others' mental health. She was a brilliant performer, but her life was a performance of calculated outrageousness that left little room for genuine human kindness. Anthony Quinn, Celebrity Count 22, represents a man of immense physical and theatrical scale who refused to share the air. McKellen remembers him as a performer who demanded absolute dominance in every frame. Quinn possessed an ego that was as large as the characters he played. He would use his physical size and his legendary status to intimidate younger actors into submission. He was known for alpha-dogging every set he walked onto, creating a hierarchy of fear where only he was allowed to be the center of it. He treated the industry like a territory to be conquered, showing a chilling disregard for the collaborative nature of filmmaking. Behind the zest for life he projected on screen was a man whose primary motivation was the total eclipse of anyone who dared to stand in his light. Oliver Reed, Celebrity Count 23, represents the wild man archetype turned into a genuine professional nightmare. Ian McKellen, who maintained a level-headed professionalism throughout the era, watched with a mixture of pity and revulsion as Reed turned the movie set into a battlefield of excess. Reed wasn't just a partier. He was a man who used his physical intensity to terrorize those around him. He would pick fights with crew members, show up intoxicated and aggressive, and use his fame as a shield for behavior that was frequently described as borderline sociopathic. He was a man who had completely lost the ability to distinguish between a performance and a provocation, turning his life into a slow-motion car crash that forced everyone around him to become an unwilling spectator. Clark Gable, Celebrity Count 24, was the king of Hollywood, but he ruled with a cold, often unforgiving hand. To the public, he was the ultimate man's man, but McKellen knew the reality of Gable's professional ruthlessness. Gable was known to be intensely competitive and could be cruelly dismissive of those he didn't consider useful to his career. He had a way of freezing people out, using his status to ensure that he was always the most important person in the room, regardless of who he had to step on to get there. Behind the famous mustache and the rakish grin was a man who viewed the world through the narrow lens of his own power, leaving a legacy of distant, often icy professional relationships that stood in stark contrast to his ruggedly charming screen persona. Finally, we must mention Stanley Kubrick, Celebrity Count 25. Early a director, he inhabited the role of the creator with a darkness that broke the